Hello everyone, this is Erik, the Asian movie enthusiast, and we now continue with our exploration of Asian horror movies released in 1999. And as always, titles for all of the movies I discuss are listed in the description box below. So let's get rolling here. Let's not waste any time today. The first movie we have on the docket today is Troublesome Night 6, a Hong Kong horror thriller hybrid. Now, this installment of this horror series scraps the anthology structure and relies on a single storyline. A detective, played by Louis Koo, of course, investigates the spirit of a dead woman who may be behind a series of killings. Now, here's a more detailed plot synopsis I found on IMDb. Now, some tabloid reporters stalked this woman, who was a model, for their gossip column. Now, the model, having broken up with her rich boyfriend, later commits suicide to escape all of the pressure. The reporters relentlessly post the photos of her dead body in their tabloid magazines. So years later, the reporters begin to die violent deaths, and an inspector is assigned to track down the perpetrator. In addition, the inspector claims he has seen the model at the crime scenes, even though it has been at least 4 years since her death. So the focus here is on the fairly enigmatic connections between the victims and the ghost, which helps to maintain interest throughout. This is also fairly stylish at times. The color red is used well early on. For instance, the ghost's dress is a shade of red. There's lots of red drapes in the set designs, etc., which is nice, I think. I always like when horror movies use color in them, because there's a lot of horror movies nowadays that have very muted color schemes where everything's kind of like grayish and it's kind of boring to look at. This movie has a little bit of flair to it in the color scheme, which is nice. There are a few Ringu-like facial blurs that are shown, but overall, the horror works pretty well. Louis Koo is good in the lead role. He's almost always good in the lead role. So anytime Louis takes the lead role in a film, it's usually an advantage and a positive, and that's true here as well. The conclusion is also reasonably satisfying. So everything kind of works. The story works pretty well here. Troublesome Night 6 has a few similarities to the Hong Kong thriller horror hybrid The Detective from 2007. Now, The Detective, in my opinion, is a better film than Troublesome Night 6 overall. But if you enjoyed that one, you get a little bit of that flavor in Troublesome Night 6 as well, only with a little bit more horror content, because The Detective was a little bit more of kind of a supernatural thriller. So, I recommend Troublesome Night 6. It was pretty good. Now, I haven't been able to find a DVD as of late, but it is available on YouTube, so it's out there for you. And the next film here is one from Thailand, and it's called Nang Nak, Thai horror romance hybrid. Now, Nang Nak is set in the 1800s and is based off of a very popular Thai legend about a man who returns home from war to his wife and child. Now, remember way back in one of the early videos in this series, I said that Yotsuya Kaidan is the most popular Japanese ghost story? Well, The Legend of Mae Nak seems to be Thailand's most popular ghost story. They have at least one shrine that is dedicated to her in real life, and there have been multiple movies about her, one of which was all the way back in 1958, apparently, which I haven't seen. There's also a related opera related to this legend, so they like their Nang Nak. I don't even know if I'm pronouncing it properly, if it's Nang Nak or Nang Nak, but forgive me if I mispronounce it. Now, this movie has a very primitive, tribal feel to it, as it takes place mostly in a swampland. And the aesthetics and overall style are very different from many other Thai horror films that take place in modern times. And that's one of the things that makes this interesting to watch. You get a little bit of a different setting there to enjoy. It's kind of like watching samurai horror films from Japan, because you're transported to a completely different time and cultural era. The characters are properly developed here, And the horror elements are classical, so not exactly scary, but effective in assisting a plot-based story. And that was true for a lot of the better samurai era horror films that we saw from Japan decades ago. Now, there's lots of cultural value here in this film, and it has one of those romanticized moods, as I like to say, which basically gives it kind of a, I wouldn't say melodramatic, maybe a little bit of a melodramatic feel, but it also gives it a little bit of an atypical feel for a horror film, especially from Thailand. You don't get a whole lot of melodrama in Thai horror, so it was nice to see that here. So if you're interested in Thai horror, I would say that this is basically a must-see, just because it's one of their most popular ghostly legends, so to speak. So I recommend this film. Now, the DVD availability is that I haven't been able to find a DVD that's widely available, but it is on YouTube, just like Troublesome Night 6, so you're in luck. Okay, so now the next film here is a little bit of a controversial choice here. Not entirely controversial, but now I mentioned in one of my previous videos that I was not a big fan of Raisin, and that I preferred the other sequel to Ringu over Raisin. And that's what we're going to cover here, and that sequel is, of course, Ringu 2 from Japan. Now this sequel, which is also directed by Hideo Nakata, follows immediately after the events of the original film. A woman with psychic abilities, played by Miki Nakatani, investigates the mysterious deaths that were caused by Sadako. Now, I've seen quite a bit of criticism of this movie online, but I think that this is a good quality film for the most part. I watched it again fairly recently, and I really got a feeling of craftsmanship to it. I really enjoyed the performances, the direction, and the pacing. It's also very moody and has some of the ominous aspects of Ringu, which I really enjoyed. There are also a few memorable and effective scares, too, one of which I believe involves two mirrors, which was very cool. Now, unfortunately, there is one rather large flaw in this film that people bring up quite a bit, and that is the finale, which is quite disappointing and does not take advantage of the science-based elements that were established early on. For example, expelling psychic energy through experimentation, which is kind of interesting in theory, but this film doesn't really gel well near the end. Still, though, this movie's better than Raisin, in my opinion. Now, Ringu 2 did have a weak ending, as I said, but at least it avoided ruining its predecessor by forcing the viewer to reinterpret scenes from Ringu in stupefying ways, like Raisin did. Now, I also prefer Ringu 2 over the Ring Virus, which we recently covered, mostly because it does its own thing and avoids being a complete retread, which I think was one of the problems with the Ring Virus. So, of those three, I guess, Ringu sequels and spin-offs, Raisin, Ringu 2, and the Ring Virus, if you take those three films, I definitely think Ringu 2 is a step above the other two. But some people like Raisin the best between those three. Other people like the Ring Virus, so I guess the only way to go is to watch all three and decide for yourself. So that's my opinion on those. Now, Ringu 2, expectedly, is widely available on DVD. And like I said, it is available in the box set. They have a Ringu box set out there that you might be able to get used that has at least 4 of the films in it. Now, the next film here is a bit nasty and a bit of a borderline exploitation film. It's another film from our good friend Daisuke Yamanouchi, who directed the terrible Girl Hell 1999, but the pretty good Red Room, both of which we covered in our last video. Now, this next film is generally considered to be his best work, and I would probably agree with that, and I am talking about Muzan-e, also known as Celluloid Nightmares, Japanese horror film. Now, this notorious film documents the video recordings of a reporter who investigates the possibility of an underground snuff film industry. Now, this film has poor production values in terms of visual and audio quality, but it proves to be a positive here in terms of conveying the documentary style. It has like a home video feel to it, and sometimes these documentary style horror films actually benefit from the low production values, as this film does. Now, there are a few adult video style snippets that appear to be exploitative and are very disgusting. I'm not going to get into what they do or how they, kind of get off. It's kind of a fetish type aspect to it. I can't even say it because it's kind of disgusting. But that impression early on fades during the latter half, which provides some truly unnerving sequences with good acting performances as well. So if you watch the beginning of this movie and you get to that, there's a scene, there's like this reporter's investigating these types of I guess underground sex and or snuff films, and some of the sexual things that they do in this are really nasty. So when you get to that scene, which I'm not going to get to, you might want to feel like turning it off, but don't, because it gets really interesting after that. So just hang on. Now, given this film's reputation, though, it's ironic that the use of pixelation accentuates the realism and effectiveness of the gore, which is minimal but effective. So, yes, there are a few disgusting scenes, but those are mostly kind of sexually based. The actual gore is at times pixelated, which means it's like blurred out, but it accentuates the disturbing aspect of it. So this movie's kind of weird because it doesn't really focus so much on the gore like some other Japanese exploitation films do. In fact, I wouldn't even consider this exploitation. It has some of those elements, but I think it rises above and actually gives you some pretty good craftsmanship here. The ending is very unexpected, which also gives it some added value. There's some interesting stuff here for sure. All in all, I think this is a quality movie that is one of the better Japanese sickies, so to speak. And the short running time of 65 minutes is also an advantage. Now, this is probably my favorite film from this director, and it is also the first documentary-style Asian horror film that we've reviewed in this Asian Horror Year in Review playlist. The Japanese would later produce a high number of horror films within this subgenre, many of which are actually pretty good and surprisingly creative, so we'll get to those later on. This is an early entry in the Japanese documentary-style, found footage, so to speak, horror film. It's a good one, if you can handle a few shady, disgusting moments. Now, Muzan-e is not widely available, but you can occasionally find a DVD on eBay and iOffer, so look out for that. Alright, so now we move on to a long-running horror series. Not quite as many installments as Troublesome Night or Shake, Rattle, and Roll, but this one has a number of films to its credit, and that is the Tomie film series. Now, we will discuss the first film, Tomie, from 1999, Japanese horror film, now. While getting treatments for her fractured memory, a young woman is stalked by a demon girl who cannot die. Now, I did previously cover the second film of this series, Tomie Another Face, in my last video. That movie was bad, but this first entry is much better. I'd like to cover the concept a bit more here, because the concept in this film is actually really interesting when you think about it. The antagonist here is basically, she infatuates men to the point of insanity, often resulting in brutal murders. Now, it's almost like her obsession, or the men's obsession with Tomie, drives them into a state of excessive paranoia or sheer lunacy, after which they lose control and start murdering people. So the interesting thing here, though, is that Tomie herself, and this is the antagonist, typically does not inflict violence against other people herself. It's her crazy fanboys that do all of the damage. In fact, her attractiveness and allure seem to be caused more by her nature, it's almost like an implicit nature, than any intentional act of her own. And this is partially evident in the fact that sometimes her fanboys actually turn against her. But I'll stop there to avoid giving away any surprises. It's a very interesting premise, as I said, that is quite different when you think about it. And overall, though, I don't think that this movie, or any of the Tomie movies for that matter, really delve into and explore this premise with any significant depth, which makes these films a little bit disappointing in that sense. But there is an intriguing psychological undercurrent that does work here, and that's a big positive, I think. Now, this film is glacially paced, and the direction makes it feel like a weird art house flick. It's kind of odd that this is considered to be a mainstream horror film, but it has an art house flair to it, man. There's some weird stuff here. It also has a recognizable style that I actually really enjoyed. Now, this also has some memorable moments of horror. There's a really strange opening sequence right from the start, and a very creepy song, actually, that's really bizarre. There's a regeneration process, which is portrayed in some cool ways. Some nicely gruesome images get tossed in. There's also a great jump scare near the end that does not use loud noise, which is quite a rarity in the realm of horror films. And I'm kind of a stickler. Jump scares kind of irritate me, but there's one near the end of this film that I think is really well crafted because there's almost no noise at all. It's really cool. I like it. The music and lighting are atmospheric. I like the use of orange near the beginning as well. I like that color scheme. Both lead actresses are good. But with all that said, I gotta tell you, this film really does move slowly, as I mentioned earlier, which will be a problem for some viewers because some scenes do drag out a bit. In fact, it took me multiple viewings to appreciate Tomie, but I do recommend this. Now, I actually watched a bunch of these Tomie films back in the day when I was just getting into Asian horror, and really, to be honest, none of them really impressed me all that much. It was only until I revisited some of them that I began to appreciate them more, and I think it's mostly because I had a little bit of trouble with the pacing the first time I saw these. But the second time I went in with that expectation, like, the pacing's going to be pretty slow here, and I focused on everything else, and I really ended up enjoying some of these. The first one's probably close to being the best one, I think. Now, this Tomie franchise currently has 9 films, 2 of which we've already covered, and the other 7 we will cover in future videos. Now, on the side note, I did read the manga, which is pretty good, but I actually prefer this first film over the manga for a variety of reasons. I just feel like this film was more ominous and threatening, I guess you could say, of an experience. I didn't really get that from the manga quite as much. But I did enjoy the manga, but I like a few of the films better. Now, Tomie is widely available on DVD. There is a box set of the Tomie films, and I think the first 5 films of the series is in that box set, so it's something worth picking up. I would actually recommend renting these first, though, but you know, I could see some people having trouble with the pacing on these. I gotta emphasize that, but after repeat viewings, they've grown on me. All right, so we've basically reached the big 4 of 1999. These 4, I think, kind of distinguish themselves and are a step above some of the other films that we've recently covered. So these are basically my 4 favorite Asian horror films from this year. The first of which is known as The Hypnotist, also known as Hypnosis, and it's also known as Saimin, Japanese horror thriller hybrid. Now, 3 apparently unrelated suicides occur on the same day in Tokyo. One involves a young athlete, the other involves a groom at a wedding reception, and the other an elderly man celebrating his wife's birthday. So a middle-aged detective investigating one of the cases begins to suspect a connection between the 3 different deaths when he discovers that each person mentioned a green monkey before they died. That's kind of an odd coincidence. You think there's these three bizarre deaths and they all mention green monkey. Automatically it piques your interest. Now, with the help of a young psychiatrist, he formulates the theory that hypnosis is somehow involved. So, in the meantime, as he's investigating these original three deaths, there are even more bizarre suicides that are reported, and the mystery intensifies. So, who will be next here, and what is the truth? That's the basic premise of the film. So it's a nice little, almost like a mystery, so to speak. This has lots of twists, this movie, and an unorthodox premise. I mean, you kind of think you're feeling the movie out during the first 30, 40 minutes, but it really throws you some curveballs, man, and I like that about this. The death scenes are unconventional, but they are a bit awkward and I would say even a little bit goofy at times, but it's one of those situations where it's kind of an awkward, creepy goofiness, kind of like The Horrors of Malformed Men, a film that I covered videos ago. You know, it's kind of goofy, but it's also kind of creepy. And the villain here is totally surprising. I did not see it coming. It just came out of nowhere. But that's a positive, I think. The entire second half of this film is just riddled with creative, memorable moments. Now, if the viewer goes into this expecting some uneasy madness, there's quite a bit of fun to be had here, despite some patches of slowness. And I wouldn't say this film has pacing issues, but there are little places where you just gotta relax and let things play out. I actually remember watching this movie with my father, and he absolutely loved it. This is one of his favorite Asian horror films. He found it to be very thought-provoking, and I remember appreciating it a bit more after rewatching it with him. I do have this movie in my DVD collection, and I really should watch it more often because I enjoy it every time I do. This was directed by Masayuki Ochiai, who also directed Infection from 2004, which we will cover later. Now, you're in luck again because The Hypnotist is widely available on DVD, so check that one out. It's a cool flick, a little bit different. Alright, so next is the second installment in a popular South Korean horror franchise. And that is Whispering Corridors 2, Memento Mori. South Korean horror film. Now in this film, a girl finds a diary written between two of her schoolmates who were romantically involved. Since this is a horror film, of course, you can probably guess that something bad happened to one of them, which sets the horrific foundations for the film as a whole. Now, similar to its predecessor, this film provides very good character development for the schoolgirls in a deliberately paced style with some very impressive acting. There are no scary scenes at all until the 40-minute mark, but afterward, those elements are peppered throughout and pretty well executed. I would say the Memento Mori is the lightest of this franchise in terms of scariness, because the horror elements are used to supplement the drama. It's almost like the drama comes first and foremost, and then the horror is peppered in throughout to supplement it. And in this case, it works well, because the drama is indeed properly developed. Now, when I discussed Whispering Corridors in a prior video, I mentioned that film had a very romanticized, sentimental tone to it. Memento Mori ramps up these feelings even more so, which makes it an interesting watch. Another positive notch in the Whispering Corridors series of films that is probably one of the best in the history of horror cinema in terms of sheer quality and consistency. Now, one of these films I actually disliked, which we will get to in a later year, but overall, this is a pretty solid series of horror films. It's also interesting to see how each of these films in this franchise are easily recognizable from one another. They are all very distinctive and different, despite having the theme of schoolgirl friendship at their cores. So it's always nice to see that, you know, instead of the horror film just repeating the same thing, these mix things up, which is quite beneficial if you were to do a marathon of them. So, Whispering Corridors 2 Memento Mori comes very much recommended. Now, again, you're in luck, because this film is widely available on DVD. Alright, so we're down to the 2 best Asian horror films from 1999. Now, some of you could probably guess what ranks as number 1, but my number 2 selection may be a surprise to you. And that's what I'm here for. I'm here to give you surprises, right? So I'm going to surprise you here. If some of you predict this one, I would be impressed. Now, this film is called Gakko no Kaidan 4, also known as Haunted School 4, from Japan. Now, in prior videos, we covered the first 3 films of this franchise, all of which were at least good, if not very good. But I must say that Gakko no Kaidan 4 is the last and best film of this movie series. And how many times can you say that about a 4th installment? This film veers completely away from its predecessors by scrapping the chased by ghosts in a haunted school premise and opting instead to use a slow-paced spookiness with more classical themes and very little humor. You know, some of the films in the franchise were, they would splice in some humor along the way, along with the horror. This film has a very muted sense of humor to it. However, the use of grammar school children as the main characters is preserved, which is one of the refreshing aspects of this franchise. Even the ghosts in this one are mischievous children. Now, the story starts off with a flashback, okay, from decades in the past, where 4 children play hide and seek but become victims of tragedy. Decades later, some other little kids awaken the ghosts and investigate as their friends begin to disappear. Now, the scare tactics here are well executed and very creative. No jump scares to be found, thankfully. There is a lot of spooky atmosphere, too. Acting by the kids is very good, and the opening sequence is actually quite stunning. It could be the best scene in the whole film. And the set designs near the end are quite excellent. Some very cool, I don't want to give anything away, I would say environments and themes during the finale. Now, this is considered to be a newer classic by the few who have seen it, and it's easy to see why. This entire series of films is worth watching with or without subtitles. But the 4th film here, ironically, is the one that pops up with subtitles if you can find it. Very enjoyable series of films here. Now, this 4th film, just to place some emphasis on it, I think should be talked about a lot more in terms of people's favorite contemporary Japanese horror films. I think maybe the DVD availability or lack thereof is one reason for this, why it's not mentioned very often, but this is really a newer classic, man. I think this is a really great film. So, as I mentioned, DVD availability, not great. It is available on Region 2 DVD, probably without subtitles, but occasionally a subtitled all-region DVD will pop up on eBay or iOffer. This is the only film of the series that I was able to find with subtitles, so you may be in luck there, but you might have to look for it. Totally worth seeking out, though. I love this movie. Alright. So I now introduce what I, and many, believe to be the best Asian horror film from 1999. In fact, the late and great Roger Swan ranked this as his personal favorite as well. And I'm talking, of course, about Audition, Japanese horror film. Now, this is arguably, I would say it could be the most popular and highly acclaimed Japanese horror film ever made, at least in terms of its attention and acclaim in the West, for sure. So, director Takashi Miike starts off with a widower who holds a staged movie audition in order to meet girls. This guy basically, he has a teenage son who's egging him on to move on after his wife's death and get remarried and move on with his life. And the father's friend is a lower-level producer who sets the audition up. Now, unfortunately, our protagonist's choice of woman is not so wise. There are some surrealistic and dreamy moments here that are also quite disturbing. Performances are top-notch. There are some truly creepy scenes, though, that result from this director's talent at slowly overturning lurking dangers. And that's kind of a big positive here, which actually I'm going to get to in a few minutes. There are some real psychological merits to this film that are quite magnificent as well, and the final 20 minutes are sufficiently harrowing. Viewers should be warned that this film includes some graphic violence to it, which you probably know. Everybody's heard about the graphic violence at the end of this film. If you haven't, I would suggest completely avoiding all discussion and just watching it. I couldn't imagine watching this movie while knowing nothing about it. That must be pretty cool. Because even when I saw this film, I knew the ending was pretty dodgy, but I had no idea. So I'm not even going to get into the details. I'll let you experience that for yourself. So now, one of the themes here is the objectification of women. But it's more multidimensional than you might think, because you do genuinely like the lead character here, even though some of his perspectives and thoughts are rather flawed. At one point, he compares the process of choosing women for this audition to choosing cars, which, I mean, come on, man. You gotta get your head out of the gutter, so to speak. Now, there are two primary criticisms that are launched at this film by the few people who dislike it. So, one, the movie is boring until the end, and two, the ending is gratuitously violent. Now, I disagree with both of these points, because really everything in this film complements one another, because it basically shows the descent from lighthearted objectification to macabre violent repercussions. I mean, the opening half hour in this is practically a romantic comedy. I mean, that audition scene is hilarious, but it serves a purpose here to show just how lightly our protagonist thinks of this chick mining idea, so to speak. And even when the warning sign starts showing up, he continues to be completely oblivious to this. Now, this shifting of tones and the structure of this film also helps to disarm the viewer, because your state of mind is very relaxed at the beginning here, which helps to make the nasty descent even more effective. So, I really think all of this is interesting to the point where if someone were to say that, this film is boring in spots, if you were to actually go and delete sections of the film, it would make it a less impactful experience overall. You basically need everything to make it work as well as it does. And with all of that said, if this movie, well, how can I say this? It's almost like a machine, so to speak. You need all of the parts to make it work, I think. And if you think that, you could get rid of the ending or make it less violent, or maybe get rid of some scenes in the middle to assist pacing, I don't know, man. You're kind of fiddling with something that works really well. So, when I really thought about these two primary criticisms, I was like, well, they might have some merit to them. And then when I started thinking about what I would take out of the film or change, I don't know, I couldn't really think of that much. So, this is a pretty solid film as is. Now, with all of that said, if this movie ever does get an American remake, there's a pretty good chance that we will actually see a movie that, number one, is boring until the end, and number two, is gratuitously violent, just based on the track record of Asian horror remakes, because the character development and the assured direction will be conspicuously absent, I suspect. But, I'm actually amazed that they haven't remade Audition yet. But, it would almost be... it would be interesting to see them try. And then you could compare what you feel the two, the people that don't like this, what they feel the two flaws are, then compare it to the American remake and see what would happen if those two flaws actually existed. I suspect. Just something I thought about. So, Audition, as many of you probably know, is widely available on DVD, so you're in luck. A lot of very widely available films in this video. So, Audition is my favorite Asian horror film from this particular year, and that does it for Asian horror for 1999. At this point in time, we have covered a grand total of 201 Asian horror films, and almost unbelievably, we have more than 450 more to go. So be sure to join me in my next video, when we will crack into the year 2000. And as always, we'll see you next time.